The name Takura Fujiwara might not have a lot of meaning to you at this moment. You were either a newcomer to the Resident Evil series via the newest entry of Resident Evil 2 Remake, or you were someone who has played some, if not all of the games, and are now wanting to dive further into the history and lore of the series. Regardless of why you were here today, you will come out of this knowing a ton more about Resident Evil and how the game was developed. I'm Sleepless Thoughts, and welcome to my series of Resident Evil 101. The year was 1989. George H.W. Bush was sworn into office on January 20th, and just one day after this event, a movie was released in Japan by the name of Sweet Home. The film follows a small film crew as they enter an old abandoned mansion that was home to a famous artist who left behind a slew of priceless paintings. This film crew set to film a documentary about restoring said paintings. Soon after they enter, a chain of horrifying events occur, and not all of them make it out alive. The film should already sound familiar to you if you know anything about the first entry into the Resident Evil series. A small group of people enter an old mansion filled with horrors and must survive and exit the nightmare in order to stay in fine status and not in the dreaded dangerous status. Needless to say, this is the basis and inspiration for 1996's Resident Evil, a masterpiece of gaming history and the game that defined survival horror. The cool thing about this film, and why it is so important to Resident Evil, other than giving the development team the eureka moment they needed, is not only was it a film, but it was also a game with the same name and setting. The game was also made by Capcom and released December of 1989, the same year the movie was released. Sweet Home was a Famicom game not released in the United States, which followed 5 characters that you controlled as you made your way around the mansion from the film, with limited resources and tons of backtracking sprinkled nicely with puzzles that needed to be solved in order to move on in the game's story. This was the prototype of the Resident Evil series, so to speak. It was the first of its kind. Move over to Resident Evil 4, you aren't the only one of the survival horror games to introduce QuickTime events. This one had those too. The game also introduced a permadeath system that would change the game, like losing the healer would result in the player having to find healing items at the point near the corpse of the fallen hero. It also changed the ending, which featured 5 different outcomes. This is something that would also be implemented in Resident Evil, as it also had different outcomes for different people who lived and died.
Are you tired, Rebecca?
Sorry, Chris. I am.
You did a really good job. This case was just too weird. This case was...
Sweet Home was directed by Takura Fujiwara, which brings us back to why Sweet Home and the man behind it was so important to the creation of Resident Evil. In 1993, the year Bill Clinton was sworn into office, Takura Fujiwara was planning to do a remake of the Sweet Home game with a team led by Shinji Mikami. The game they were working on would be known in Japan as Biohazard. With a US release planned, the name would not work because of another game at the time taking that title. So they held a company contest to come up with a US release name, and lo and behold, what we know as Resident Evil was born. Move over Resident Evil Survivor and Resident Evil 7, the first-person shooter gameplay was not just yours at first for Resident Evil. Shinji Mikami originally intended for the game to be an FPS, but ultimately underwent many changes before landing on the tank controls and pre-rendered backgrounds we came to know and love. Also, along the lines of future entries of the series in the form of Resident Evil 5, the original also went through the concept of being a two-player co-op via a connection between consoles, but failed to reach the standard that Shinji Mikami wanted for the game. And to the hardcore fans like myself, we thank him for that decision. Just like the earlier games and their backtracking, the development teams of the future installments seem to backtrack to some of the earlier ideas of the game. During the first months of the game, Shinji Mikami worked solo, creating concept art, characters, and writing over 40 pages of script. It was in this early development stage that he also came across another game titled Alone in the Dark, which featured fixed camera angles. This is what changed his mind from the first-person view of the game, stating that it detached the player, but aided in the immersion of the game. Also added but later removed from the game was the graveyard, that did make its way into the 2002 remake of Resident Evil. Also left out were the guest houses and a tower area, which both were replaced by the guardhouse and lab section of the game. Alpha versions of the game would begin to circulate into the hands of some lucky players for them to check out the game and how it would play. Remaining pretty much the same other than the exclusion of Jill as a playable character, it had a few minor tweaks and missing or cut content from the full release. The best part of the game itself was the amazing opening live-action scenes that were filmed in Japan with the use of American actors with fully English voiceovers featuring Japanese subtitles, even in the Japanese release of the game. However, a fully Japanese voiceover was recorded but left on the cutting room floor by Shinji Mikami due to him feeling the quality was not good enough, which is a bit laughable seeing that the American voiceover work was silly at best, but it adds to the overall charm of the game and is a classic gem in the history of Resident Evil. No one can do a video or a reference to Resident Evil without mentioning the Jill sandwich line.
Stay away from the door, Jill. I'm gonna kick this door down. Hurry! This way!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
These live-action scenes would be cut down in the US release due to censorship of some of the gore and scenes of Chris Redfield smoking a cigarette. These are small changes and honestly had no impact on the gameplay itself. However, the gameplay was changed quite a bit for the US release at the command of Capcom North America. These changes made the game harder, such as enemies doing a considerable amount of damage compared to the Japanese release, as well as reducing the amount of ink ribbons in the game to make saving a bit harder to do, and also removing the auto-aim feature that was in the Japanese release. These changes were made so that the game could be rented from a video store more often in order for the player to complete it. Even the development team of the game had a hard time completing the US release, stating it had to be played more carefully in order to complete. The game was released in the US on March 22nd of 1996 for the Sony PlayStation. Shinji Mikami thought the game would sell around 200,000 copies and gather a relatively small fan base. However, the game went on to do a global sale of around 2,750,000, making it a big hit and beginning a legacy that keeps on going to this day. Soon after the release of Resident Evil, the team began work on a follow-up that would reportedly return 3 years later to the remains of the Spencer Mansion, after it had been taken over by the plant BOWs, that stands for Bioorganic Weapons. Not much is known about this title, known as Biohazard or RE in the West, other than it was going to be a spin-off game that would uncover more secrets underneath the area of the Tyrant Room in the lab from the original game and change some of the rooms of the mansion in order to give the player a new experience. This title was ultimately cancelled in order to make way for the masterpiece of gaming, Resident Evil 2, which was announced in 1996. However, this would also be a story of a game with a few changes over its development, but that's a tale for another time. I hope you liked this video going over the development of the original Resident Evil. If you learned something new, make sure to drop a like, and if you want to know more about Resident Evil lore and story, be sure to comment and subscribe to keep up to date with my videos. This was my first video and it took some time to research and to work on, so many kind words are welcome and appreciated. I will leave links to the resources that I used in the video in the description below. Thank you for your time and follow your dreams, live your nightmares. Good night.